Big Bayou Canoe rail accident. So if you think about train safety, you probably imagine high-tech systems and tight regulations keeping everything on track. But on September 22, 1993, a seemingly random series of oversights turned into one of the deadliest train crashes in US history. It all started when a towboat operated by an untrained pilot accidentally slammed into a bridge over the Big Bayou Canot in Alabama. The crash knocked the bridge out of alignment, bending the tracks into a deadly curve. What makes this even more shocking? The towboat operator didn't even realize the damage they'd caused and sailed off as if nothing had happened. Hours later, the Amtrak Sunset Limited train came barreling down the track at 70 miles per hour, carrying 220 passengers and crew. The train slammed into the misaligned bridge and derailed, with the lead engine and several cars plunging into the murky waters of the bayou. The impact killed 47 people and injured over 100 others. Some survivors managed to escape, but others were trapped as the wreckage ignited in a fiery blaze. The combination of water, fire, and twisted steel turned the rescue operation into a nightmare. One detail that still chills people today is how avoidable the whole disaster was. The bridge didn't have any navigation lights, making it nearly impossible for the towboat pilot to see where they were going. On top of that, there was no systems in place to notify trains about structural damage to the bridge. It was like a perfect storm of oversight and negligence. Survivors and rescuers have shared harrowing stories of what unfolded that night. People trapped underwater were banging on the train's windows, desperately trying to escape. First responders risked their lives, wading through burning wreckage and thick smoke. Even locals joined in, pulling passengers from the bayou with whatever they could find. In the aftermath, the National Transportation Safety Board launched an investigation that revealed a glaring lack of coordination between railroads and waterways. The disaster led to stricter rules for barge operators and better safety measures for bridges, but for the victims and their families, the changes came too late. This accident remains Amtrak's deadliest to date and serves as a grim reminder of how small mistakes can snowball into colossal tragedies. Every time a train crosses a bridge now, safety protocols born from the Big Bayou Canoe disaster are working behind the scenes to keep passengers safe. Missouri train derailment. Picture this, June 27, 2022. That was supposed to be a quiet day for passengers aboard the Amtrak Southwest Chief. The train was cruising through Missouri's scenic countryside when it suddenly collided with a dump truck at an unprotected grade crossing in Mendon. The result was a horrifying derailment that left 4 people dead and over 150 injured. Here's where it gets frustrating. The crossing wasn't equipped with gates or warning lights, just a stop sign. Yes, in 2022, some railway crossings in rural areas still rely on what's essentially a gamble in life. The truck driver, who was hauling a load of rocks, didn't clear the tracks in time. When the train hit, it was moving at nearly 90 miles per hour, turning the collision into a disaster. Passengers described the moments after impact as pure chaos. Train cars tipped over like dominoes, throwing people from their seats and slamming them into the walls. Luggage, drinks, and even passengers flew through the air. In the middle of it all, ordinary people became heroes, helping strangers escape through broken windows and overturned cars. What made the rescue even more heart-wrenching was the location. Mendon is a small rural town, and first responders had to navigate bumpy dirt roads to reach the crash site. Local farmers and residents jumped into action, using their trucks and equipment to assist victims before emergency crews arrived. This tragedy exposed glaring gaps in rail safety, especially in rural America. It reignited debates about the need to modernize unprotected crossings. With over 5,000 such crossings still in use, the Mendon crash wasn't just a freak accident. It was a stark reminder of how much work remains to be done. Every survivor's story from Mendon adds a layer to the narrative of resilience and community spirit. Yet, it's hard to ignore the bitter truth. Better safety measures could have prevented the crash altogether. Maryland train collision. Imagine stepping onto a train for a routine trip only to have your life forever changed by someone else's recklessness. That's what happened on January 4, 1987, near Chase, Maryland, when the Amtrak's Colonial train collided with 3 Conrail freight locomotives. The freight crew? They'd been smoking marijuana. And yes, that impairment led to one of the most catastrophic train accidents in US history. The freight train ran through multiple warning signals before blocking the tracks. Meanwhile, the Amtrak train packed with over 600 passengers was speeding along at 108 miles per hour. By the time the engineers saw the freight locomotives, it was too late. The collision was so violent that the lead Amtrak locomotive and several passenger cars were completely destroyed. 16 people died and nearly 200 were injured. Survivors described the moment of impact as an explosion with metal, glass, and bodies flying everywhere. Many were trapped in the wreckage, screaming for help. Rescuers faced a harrowing scene, cutting through twisted steel to reach those inside. What's most shocking is how preventable this tragedy was. Drug use among railway workers wasn't being strictly monitored at the time. The Chase collision led to sweeping reforms, including mandatory drug and alcohol testing for railway employees. It's horrifying to think that it took such a massive loss of life to prompt such an obvious safety measure. The aftermath wasn't just physical, it was emotional. Passengers and their families had to grapple with the knowledge that this disaster stemmed from negligence. Lawsuits followed, as did public outrage, but for the victims, no amount of money could bring back their loved ones. Today, the Chase collision stands as a grim reminder of the human cost of carelessness. It's a tragedy that fundamentally changed how the US approaches rail safety, but it came at an unthinkable price. Valhalla train crash. Alright, February 3rd, 2015 began like any other winter evening in Valhalla, New York, with commuters taking the Metro North Harlem Line train home. But for 6 people, it would tragically be their last ride. This horrific crash involved the train colliding with an SUV stuck on the tracks at a grade crossing, and it remains the deadliest accident in Metro North's history. The sequence of events is baffling. The driver of the SUV, Ellen Brody, drove onto the tracks and then, instead of reversing when the crossing gates came down, she got out to inspect her car. Witnesses say she calmly returned to the vehicle and tried to cross directly into the path of an oncoming train. The train struck the SUV at full speed, causing a fiery explosion that engulfed the first train car. The impact was devastating. The train's electrified third rail broke free, piercing the lead car and turning it into a deadly furnace. Passengers scrambled to escape through broken windows, some climbing over fellow commuters to flee the smoke and flames. The crash claimed 6 lives, including Brody's, and injured 15 others. What makes this crash especially haunting is the preventable nature of it all. The grade crossing was already infamous for its confusing layout. Drivers often found themselves accidentally stranded on the tracks. Locals had complained about it for years, yet no substantial action was taken until after the crash. The Valhalla disaster led to renewed scrutiny of rail crossings nationwide. It also highlighted the need for public education about the dangers of stopping on tracks. But for the victims' families, these lessons came far too late. Even today, commuters passing through Valhalla can't help but think about that night. It's a stark reminder that something as ordinary as a daily train ride can turn into a nightmare when safety is overlooked. Chatsworth train collision. So September 12, 2008 is a day forever etched in the memory of Southern California. It was a sunny afternoon when the Metrolink commuter train carrying nearly 230 passengers collided head-on with a Union Pacific freight train in Chatsworth. The reason? The Metrolink engineer was texting while driving, a jaw-dropping act of negligence that led to 25 deaths and over 100 injuries. The collision was brutal. The Metrolink train failed to stop at a red signal, barreling directly in the freight train at full speed. The lead passenger car telescoped into the freight train's locomotive, crushing those inside. Survivors recall the impact as an explosion, with people and debris flying in all directions. What's especially gut-wrenching is how avoidable this was. Investigators discovered that the engineer was distracted by his phone, exchanging texts with a teenager about train operations. It's hard to fathom lives lost because someone couldn't wait to send a message. The aftermath was chaotic. First responders described the crash site as something out of a war zone, with mangled metal, scattered belongings, and passengers crying out for help. Some victims were trapped for hours before rescuers could reach them. The community rallied, with locals donating blood and offering support to the injured and grieving. This tragedy brought sweeping changes to railway safety. It spurred the US to implement positive train control, a system designed to automatically stop trains before collisions or derailments. While PTC has undoubtedly saved lives since then, it's heartbreaking that it took a disaster of this scale to push for its adoption. The Chatsworth crash stands as a sobering reminder of the deadly consequences of distraction. It's a cautionary tale not just for train operators, but for anyone behind the wheel. Chicago commuter rail crash. The morning of October 30th, 1972 started like any other rush hour in Chicago, with commuters crowding onto trains to get to work. But on this day, tragedy struck when 2 Illinois Central Gulf commuter trains collided at 27th Street Station, killing 45 people and injuring over 300. It remains one of the deadliest train accidents in Chicago's history. The crash happened because of a mix-up in signal communication. A southbound train had stalled on the tracks, and a following train, unable to stop in time, slammed into it from behind. The impact was so severe that the rear cars of the first train were crushed like soda cans. What makes this disaster particularly haunting is how routine it all seemed, until it wasn't. Passengers were reading newspapers, chatting, or simply zoning out when the crash turned their world upside down. Survivors described being thrown from their seats, landing in piles of debris and bodies. The response was swift, but grim. Rescue crews worked tirelessly to pull survivors from the wreckage, while hospitals scrambled to treat hundreds of injuries. The crash site became a scene of heartbreak, with families rushing to hospitals to find their loved ones. The investigation revealed glaring issues with signal systems and communication between trains. It was a wake-up call for Chicago's commuter rail network, prompting upgrades to signals and protocols. But for the victims, these improvements came too late. Even today, the 1972 crash serves as a stark reminder of how quickly normalcy can shatter. For Chicagoans, it's a piece of the city's history they wish had never happened. Chualar Bus Crash. So, December 23, 1963 should have been just another workday for a group of Mexican farm laborers headed to the fields near Chualar, California. Instead, it turned into one of the deadliest accidents involving farm workers in U.S. history. A freight train collided with their overcrowded bus, killing 32 people and injuring 25. The tragedy unfolded at a rural railroad crossing with no warning lights or gates. The bus driver, likely distracted or misjudging the train's speed, drove onto the tracks. Moments later, a Southern Pacific freight train slammed into the bus, splitting it in two and scattering debris and passengers over a 200-yard stretch. What made this crash especially heartbreaking was the plight of the victims. Most of them were migrant farm workers crammed into a bus designed for far fewer people. Survivors described the moments after the impact as a scene of chaos. Bodies lying on the ground, cries for help, and the acrid smell of diesel and blood. The aftermath exposed the dire conditions faced by migrant laborers at the time. The bus was not only overcrowded, but also poorly maintained, a grim reflection of how little regard was given to the safety of these workers. The accident led to calls for improved transportation standards for farm workers, though change came slowly. This crash also brought to light the dangers of unprotected rural crossings. While modern crossings often have gates and warning systems, many rural areas still rely on outdated setups, leaving drivers and passengers vulnerable to similar tragedies. The Chualar Bus Crash is remembered as more than just a transportation disaster. It's a stark reminder of the systemic neglect faced by migrant workers and a call to action to prevent such preventable tragedies. Graniteville Train Crash. January 6, 2005, a small town in South Carolina was rocked by an industrial disaster that felt more like something out of a movie than real life. A Norfolk Southern freight train collided with a parked train at Graniteville, releasing a deadly cloud of chlorine gas. The crash killed 9 people and injured over 250, making it one of the worst chemical spills in U.S. rail history. The accident was caused by a simple yet catastrophic mistake. A crew had failed to switch the tracks back to their main position after a previous operation, leaving the parked train directly in the path of the oncoming freight train. The collision caused a puncture in one of the tank cars, releasing approximately 60 tons of chlorine gas into the air. The scene was nothing short of apocalyptic. Residents woke up coughing, struggling to breathe as the greenish-yellow gas spread through the town. First responders rushed in, but even they had to contend with the toxic fumes, wearing protective gear to rescue people. Entire neighborhoods were evacuated, and Graniteville became a ghost town overnight. The 9 deaths included workers at the nearby textile mill and a train engineer who succumbed to the gas while trying to escape. Many of the injured suffered long-term respiratory issues, and some residents reported PTSD from the traumatic event. The Graniteville disaster exposed critical flaws in rail safety and chemical transportation protocols. It led to stricter regulations for the handling of transportation of hazardous materials, but the memory of that day still lingers in Graniteville. For the residents, the crash wasn't just an industrial accident. It was a wake-up call about the risks that come with living near freight rail lines. It's a story of tragedy, but also resilience as the town slowly rebuilt itself in the years that followed. Washington Metro Train Collision. So, on June 22, 2009, Washington, D.C.'s usually reliable metro system turned into a scene of horror. During the evening rush hour, a train traveling on the Red Line crashed into a stationary train near Fort Totten Station. The collision killed 9 people and injured over 80, making it the deadliest accident in the Metro's history. What caused this catastrophe? A failure in the Metro's automated train control system. The system, designed to prevent collisions, malfunctioned and failed to detect the stopped train on the tracks. The moving train was operating in automatic mode, with the operator unable to stop in time. The impact was devastating. The moving train slammed into the rear of the stationary one at full speed, crumpling the lead car like an accordion. Survivors described the chaos as passengers were thrown from their seats, hitting walls and each other. Emergency crews faced a harrowing task, pulling victims from the mangled wreckage as distraught family members waited for news. The crash highlighted glaring safety lapses within the Washington Metro system. Investigators discovered that the train involved was one of an older series known for its structural weakness. Despite warnings from safety experts, these trains hadn't been upgraded or replaced. The accident led to sweeping reforms, including the eventual replacement of older train models and increased oversight of Metro's safety protocols. But for many Washingtonians, the scars remain. This tragedy was a harsh reminder that even in a city known for its efficiency and innovation, complacency and safety can have devastating consequences. Today, every ride on the Metro carries lessons learned from that fateful day.